Um, the question, before we get going here, the question really is, why are we all here? And I think the answer is we're interested in improved internet service of Falmouth. And the other question, I'll get to more detail on that in a second. The other question is, why would I, a 79-year-old retired guy, get involved in this initiative? And so I'll try to answer those questions briefly before we get into the meat of the meeting. But before that, I would like to introduce the folks who've joined with me on this effort. We are 5 interested and concerned residents of Falmouth who believe that the time is ripe for the Falmouth community to invest in its future. None of us stands to profit from this effort. Our goal is simply to build support for and facilitate the creation of a 21st century infrastructure in Falmouth in the form of a community-based fiber optic network that will improve the quality of our lives, promote economic development and innovation that will diversify our economy and create jobs, and create a host of other benefits, such as in education, in the delivery of medical care. The possibilities are endless. So let me introduce our committee. First, Brooks Bartlett. He's back there. Brooks is director of the Economic Development Industrial Corporation, a nonprofit furthering economic development in Falmouth. He's also director of the Falmouth Chamber of Commerce. Peter Cook. Peter is Information Systems Department Head at the Falmouth Public Library and has long been involved in the issues of community networks.
But I'm here as a private citizen.
Right. And he's here as a private citizen. Third of all, Art Gaylord. Is Art there? Art is co-founder and chairman emeritus of Open Cape, and he's retired information technology director at Hui. David Eisenberg. David is a distinguished member of the technical staff of Bell AT&T Labs. He's retired from that. He's a former senior advisor during the Obama administration to the Federal Communications Commission. And finally, there's me. I'm a retired teacher, a retired builder, a retired Cape Cod Marathon director, and I'm a member of the Falmouth Conservation Commission. So why are we here? Broadband communication over fiber optic cable is as important to our future as was the coming of the railroads in the 19th century. The paved all-weather roads in the 20th century, the introduction of electricity first in the urban areas and eventually across the country in the last century. Like these earlier infrastructure developments, a fiber optic network that reaches every home and business in Falmouth and more broadly across the entire U.S. will have an enormous impact on our lives and those of us who follow. Fiber optic networks are a reality in many parts of the world and in the U.S. Japan's coverage, for example, reaches 74% of its population. South Korea, 72% of its population. And China is rapidly expanding its fiber optic network and expects to reach 80% coverage very soon. By way of contrast, fiber optic networks serve only 11% of the U.S. population. Bringing this home to Falmouth, we lag behind in many areas in the U.S., and in the world, despite having world-class scientific institutions and many spin-off businesses, while that rely heavily on high-speed internet connection. While Open Cape, about which more will be said later by the folks on this committee, does provide fiber optic high-speed internet connections to town offices, the library, schools, and the scientific institutions in Woods Hole, and soon businesses on Main Street. Fiber optic connection to homes and businesses throughout Falmouth remain a dream. It has been pointed out that perhaps there isn't a viable market for fiber in Falmouth, for if there were, the major telecoms would have already built it. And there's a valid point to that, if the goal is to maximize profits for one's shareholders. But what is important to understand, however, is that Falmouth is not alone in the United States of being underserved. Once we get away from the densely populated urban and suburban areas, fiber optic networks are much scarcer because the economics don't work for major profit-oriented telecoms. However, more than 800 underserved communities across the US and in Massachusetts have taken the challenge and have decided to take control of their own destiny by building and successfully operating their own community-owned broadband networks based on fiber optic cable, and have done so as in public service. And more are on the way. Their success rests on three basic premises. One, they provide similar or better quality services than the major telecoms at an equivalent or lesser price. Second, they provide superior service to their customers. And thirdly, the money stays in the community. That has been the formula. So, why not Falmouth? That's the question that must be addressed at tonight's meeting. Finally, on a personal note, why on earth would I get involved with this initiative? Simply stated, I'm a citizen of Falmouth with extensive roots in this community. My father and my grandfather lived here. My father used to work in the municipal power plant on Trenton Avenue shoveling coal and giving out popcorn and peanuts at the Falmouth Commodore games in Falmouth Heights. I've lived here for over 40 years. And in that time, I've come to think that I must give back to the community. And I believe deeply that Falmouth needs to invest and must invest in its future. I'm retired after a 16-year teaching career, and 30 years in the construction business, running my own company, and 30 years directing the Cape Cod Marathon. I served on the Falmouth Conservation Commission since 2003. So why not go sit on a beach, play golf, and enjoy life? The answer is that I have a citizen's duty to give back to the community that has meant so much and given so much to me and my family. I feel that in this case, what I've learned that is Falmouth is underserved with broadband, and so I began to read about it, and I said, I want to do something about this. Why can't Falmouth have what other communities have, community-based networks? So I decided to do something, and have gotten involved, and we are looking for you to help going forward. This meeting is, and actually once I started on this little journey, 4 people, the ones that I just introduced, stepped to the plate with no other interest than to see Falmouth be a better place. We hope others will join us on this. And finally, there's an apt Chinese proverb that applies in this situation. A journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. So before getting into the meat of this meeting, I want to go over a couple of ground rules to facilitate things. We want you to participate by asking questions and become involved in the discussion as the evening goes on. We want this to be a productive evening for everyone that's in here. As the agenda notes, the heart of the meeting will begin with an overview of the issue by David Eisenberg, and that will be followed by a talk by David Talbert, who is our guest speaker, and who has considerable experience with other communities that decided to establish their own networks and who will be introduced by David following David's talk. Following those two presentations, we'll open up the meeting to a question and answer session. When you came to the meeting, we hope you signed in and got a card on which to write down any questions you might have had. If you didn't get a card and want one so you can write a question, raise your hand and Peter or somebody else will make sure that you get one during the course of the meeting. Now, if you have questions that you want to turn in at this point, Peter will collect them, or you can hold on and we'll collect them later on. And what we'll do is we'll collate those together, so similar questions, rather than being asked multiple times, we'll pick one that's representative, and then the members of this committee will discuss it and hopefully provoke some discussion. Also, during the presentations, if you want to ask a question of either David, raise your hand and I'll recognize you, or they will. And they will try to give you a quick answer. If the question requires a more extensive answer or clearly would lead to more general discussion, then Peter will note the topic on this whiteboard and we will come back to it during the Q&A. So that's the basic ground rules. I won't give you a quiz on that. We'll move ahead. And so it's now time for David Eisenberg to get up and give his presentation, a primer on fiber.
That's okay. Right here is fine. Okay. Thank you, Courtney. Great introduction to a fairly deep topic. And thank you all for coming. It's great to see a full room. I really appreciate it. And one of the key things that I want to tell you, and I'll tell you several times, the way that a community gets a network is primarily through community support. We can do it together. It will not be done for us. And if we decide to do it, then the technology is easy to build, the money is easy to find, et cetera, et cetera. But what has to come first, what has to be the basis of a community network is the community. So thank you all for coming. We hope to see you on a more regular basis and gain your involvement as this effort goes forward. So a community network actually is a fairly old concept. Back in the 1890s, when electricity was just starting to be a thing, there were investor-owned electrical companies that went to the big cities and built power plants and started to light up light bulbs and serve the community in that way. And there were other more rural communities that it didn't make sense for the investor-owned utilities to go to, and so they were underserved, or they were only served for the major factories or only in certain areas. So in many cases, communities decided to build their own electrical plant. Today, 15% of electricity in the United States, 15% of customers, it's a rough ballpark, it depends on what exactly you're measuring, but approximately 15% of electricity is generated by public power associations. Community networks, by analogy, are also largely initiated and maintained by communities that are underserved. Verizon's fiber optic service stops at the Bourne Bridge. They decided not to cross the bridge. As a result, Comcast is the only game in town. I think they're pretty good. I think they're pretty expensive. And I don't know if you've noticed, but I certainly have noticed that on a rainy day in the summertime, when nobody's at the beach but everybody's on Netflix, service gets a little spotty. Verizon DSL, which is their inferior product, was out for 5 days in parts of Falmouth last summer. And yeah, eventually they got it fixed, but you know, 5 days without internet service when we do almost everything on the internet, that was a pretty big deal for some of us. So a community network in general is built with today's technology. As Court says, that's fiber. Community networks in general are faster, less expensive, and more reliable than investor-owned networks because they're built more robustly. They're built for service, not for profit. They attract new businesses and jobs. I mean, you've already said most of this stuff, so I'm just going to move on to the next slide. Whoops, there we go. There are over 800 community networks in the United States. There are various flavors of community network, and David Talbot will go into that a little bit more in depth later. In Massachusetts, the closest community network to us is Taunton, where the city runs the cable plant. There's Norwood and Brockton and Reading, Massachusetts, and Eastern Massachusetts, and a bunch of communities in Western Massachusetts. David will discuss that. Oh, I forgot to mention one thing. See those red states? Those red states have laws prohibiting or restricting the building of community networks. Massachusetts, it turns out, is not a red state, if you haven't noticed already. So that's a big advantage that we have. There are laws that actually facilitate the building of community networks in this state. In Falmouth, we have about 14,000 residential households, more or less, year-round. Maybe triple that in the summer. If I were an investor, would I want to build a network that was so robust it would serve every need for the 12 rainy days in the 10 weeks of summer? Or would I sort of eat that, take that hit, and build a skinnier, more profitable network? Well, I think you know the answer. A community network is built with a different set of logic, and so it would be robust. And we do intend to serve many tens of thousands. The exact service level will be determined by a feasibility study that we hope you'll support. The assumption, of course, is that Comcast will continue to exist, Verizon DSL will continue to exist, we'll have some new mobile services, and our community network will compete on a level playing field with all of these investor-owned services. The network technologies that are available, well, the first two are probably non-starters. Satellite it's possible to do internet over satellite in very rural areas where you don't mind having a several-second delay between what you click on and what then gets painted on your screen. 5G is a new, mostly mobile technology that will be owned lock, stock, and barrel by Verizon, so it doesn't qualify as a community network. This leaves two technologies that are potentially viable. One is fixed wireless, which would be a wireless antenna in a small neighborhood serving an antenna receiver, a transceiver on your house. And that community antenna would be served by fiber optics. or we could run fiber optics to the home. There are pros and cons for both, and of course the end game is fiber to every home. What is fiber? Fiber is a thin strand of glass that serves as a waveguide for light. The light is pulsed at billions of pulses a second. Those are the bits of information. The capacity of a fiber optic cable, which could be from a dozen fibers up to 1,000 fibers, is essentially infinite. Art Gaylord says that Open Cape's backbone that serves Cape Cod can carry the whole traffic of the internet if you spend money on the electronics to light the fiber that Open Cape has. Fiber, the glass itself lasts at least 30 years, and you upgrade it by changing out the electronics at each end of the glass, the lasers and the computation that drives the lasers. So a key fact about fiber is that if you construct rings of fiber, the rings are inherently bidirectional. So, for example, if you have a fiber cut, if a car hits a pole and the fiber cable gets broken between Falmouth and East Falmouth, then the traffic can route around through Woods Hole and West Falmouth virtually instantaneously, so that all, even with one cut in a ring, all of the nodes continue to maintain service. This is important. Open Cape, you'll see, has, it's constructed in several rings. Hang on here. Where are we? Here's a ring. There's a ring. And Falmouth has its own ring. Actually, I believe it goes like that. But in any case, the reliability of the network comes from its architecture. There's a closer look at Falmouth's ring. Falmouth, by virtue of its geography, because we have South Falmouth, otherwise known as Woods Hole, and there's a lot of Open Cape infrastructure in Falmouth that's already there for us to use. So I'm sure you all have a lot of questions. Here are some of the ones that I thought of. Who builds and runs the fiber optic network? And one answer is that the town of Falmouth can run it directly or can charter an entity to run it, such as a utility district or an electric light district in Falmouth. In Massachusetts, there are several so-called electric light districts that only exist to run fiber optic communications networks. The EDIC, the Economic Development Industrial Corporation, is a potential entity to run such a network. There are numerous partnerships with private entities that we can discuss at length. That Open Cape, of course, is a very good candidate to run such a network. These types of issues, these options, are addressable with a good feasibility study. Now, the bottom line is that the feasibility study won't tell us, do it this way. It'll say, if you do it this way, there will be pros and cons. If you do it that way, there will be other pros and other cons, et cetera, et cetera. Now, financing. not such a big problem. If we support it, there will be financing. We could do municipal bonds. There are various federal grants and programs, state grants and programs. As in the previous slide, public-private partnerships. And there's even some successful networks in more rural areas usually where a community ponies up the money, $2,000 or $3,000 a house in advance, and when enough homes in an area decide pony up the money or pledge the money, then they build that area. So that's another way to go. But the experience across the board is that if we want it, it will come. So the goal of this meeting is to build support for a feasibility study. There are several vendors. One of them is represented here today. The feasibility study comes up with quantitative answers and generates a roadmap with multiple paths. Usually when people talk about a roadmap as an analogy when they're planning, they're talking about a particular route from A to B. That's more like a triptych. A real roadmap shows you the several alternatives and has the big, thick blue lines and the little red lines, and you can decide how you want to get there. Okay? So if you all agree, and if the thinking comes together, then a group of us need to sit down and write a request for proposals and contact the people who are good at doing this kind of feasibility study. And there's half a dozen entities in the United States that we know of at this time that are capable of doing this kind of study. The estimated cost is $50,000. The estimated time is 6 months. There are more questions addressable by a feasibility study. The main one that we are answering tonight is how to build community support. And then, of course, who builds it, who runs it, what kind of technology do we use? Do we just want to provide internet service, or do we want to provide internet, phone, and TV? Do we want to do test neighborhoods, incremental build, or do we want to make a plan for the whole town and then just construct it? And at some point, we should talk about partnering with neighboring towns or expanding what we know and what we've done to include neighboring towns. So I've created falmouthnet@gmail.com. If you have questions or want to get in touch or want to help, it's falmouthnet@gmail.com. And if you've given us your name and email address, you'll probably get some emails from falmouthnet@gmail.com. Anyway, so that's my presentation. David Talbot is going to go into it in more depth. David is an employee of CTC Communications and Energy. Is that correct? Close enough? Okay. CTC is a public-spirited, are you a public benefit corporation?
Our clients are towns and cities and counties and public entities.
Their specialty is in helping public entities figure stuff like this out. And I've had a long friendship with David's boss, Joanne Hovis. Full disclosure, she's just a wonderful person. I really deeply respect her. But I have to say, if we get to the RFP stage, we're gonna do an open RFP and make sure that all of the vendors of such studies know about it, and we'll evaluate the responses to our RFP in an open way. But let me continue with my introduction of David. David Before he joined CTC Energy, he was at Harvard's Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society. The name keeps getting longer every couple of years. Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society is a home for a lot of really good policy-oriented research on all aspects of the internet. David, while he was there, did a study on community networks that showed that basically you got more for less, no surprise there, but he actually tracked the figures down. And he's also a member of the Reading, Massachusetts Electric Power Board, which is a public power entity. So please welcome David to Falmouth. David Talbot.
Thanks very much, David, for that wonderful talk and for the introduction. And it is the latter of those three hats that it really kind of helps me get the local government experience being on the are you able to hear me now? Okay. So being on the board of the Reading Municipal Light Department, Board of Commissioners, so the local government, I understand a bit about how things get done and how challenging some of the decisions can be to make. What I wanted to do most of all, I think David outlined at the end of his talk kind of what your variety of options would be for improving your internet service, in Falmouth. And there's not one flavor of how to do this. There's a number of different models, and David outlined them very well, so he actually saved me a couple of minutes at the end of my talk. What I thought would be most helpful would be to bring us back to the state of Massachusetts and explain some of the things that are going on elsewhere in the state. So this is sort of the outline of what I'll do. David gave a bit of an overview on what the technologies are. I'll then go into some of the Massachusetts case studies, what a feasibility project would look like, and then according to your agenda, do the questions and discussion. This is just the quick technology primer on why fiber is sort of better than everything else, and it's showing you that fiber as deployed is already the fastest and best of the technologies and will continue to be for many years and decades to come. There's nothing really on the horizon that's going to be better than fiber optic cable for carrying information. However, Comcast is deploying, perhaps not in Falmouth, I don't know exactly, increasingly improved coaxial-based service called DOCSIS 3.1. You do have it. So that's nipping at fiber's heels, but fiber always has much more room to run. DSL, so copper-based telephone technologies are here, and there's various speeds of those. And as you've heard, you had an outage last summer, and you know that already. The wireless technologies, you've heard a lot about 5G probably, which is mostly marketing hype at this point. But the wireless technology that everybody's using on their smartphone is 4G, and it's getting, the coverage is improving thanks to the installation of more and more antennas on light poles called small cells. And that will also be continuing in parallel to whatever the wired broadband providers are doing. Before I go to that slide, my great aunt used to live in Falmouth, and just to see what the service level would be at her house, I went on the Comcast site. The reason I did that is because David made the analogy to municipal power providers, and that is a very important analogy to make, with the exception of the fact that sort of in Reading, which is one of those municipal power providers, we're a regulated monopoly, and so are the other ones. But in Falmouth, of course, with the broadband, you would have a competitor. At my great aunt's house on Siders Pond Road, this is the offer that I got last night. So you have this competitor who would be, obviously there and probably improving their service with whatever you did. So that would be a knock-on benefit and another trend that would occur. And I'd like to move into the state of Massachusetts context. I took that picture shortly before the fiber rollouts occurred. I knew I'd get at least one laugh. Thankfully, it was David. To give you a sense of the context of what types of things are going on in the state, basically you have, as David described, you have these municipal power utilities, some of which have done internet service, and then you have a bunch of unserved towns in western Massachusetts that only had DSL that are doing a variety of things. So to do the first group first, we could have a nice geography quiz here about which one is that right there. I think the answer is that is Shrewsbury, Massachusetts. So the yellow and the red are all towns or cities in Massachusetts that do have these municipal power utilities dating back 100 years. Of the 40 of these entities, you have about 10 or 11 which have gone into the internet business. And they typically did so in the 90s, although some have done so more recently. One of the more recent ones is Concord, which is that larger red square there in eastern Massachusetts, of course, which has done a fiber to the home business in the last 5 years. They've built that out. I want to focus your attention on one of these 10 or 11, and that is Norwood, which is a town that has a town department that's an electric department and went into the internet business. And I talked to Darrell Hansen, who runs their internet side of their business, to get a sense of what they do. This is the page that you get on the Norwood Light broadband homepage. That's their basic pitch is, hey, we're the local guys. Another one of their pitches is, when you work with us, your money's going to Main Street, not to Wall Street. As you see from their little pitch on the top, there's local service, everyday low package prices, not short-term promotions that increase in price later on. Norwood has been very successful in its business. It entered at a time when, like Falmouth, it only had Comcast as a competitor. And as it went along, Verizon Fios did come in, and you wonder, well, how did this all play out? And so Darrell was nice enough to send me this slide. So you had, the blue is Norwood Light Broadband's business, which started in 2002 with about 2,000 customers. At the time it started, Comcast, this is the video side of the business, so there's also phone or data only, that Comcast had 8,000 customers in Norwood at the time. And by 2005, basically Norwood ate Comcast's lunch. And Norwood was up to about 5,000, and Comcast was trailing with high 4,000s. So this is what Norwood Light Broadband did in the town of Norwood. Now, Fios came in 2007, and that's the light blue line, so that's the Verizon fiber optic service. And it came in and it started sort of taking a little bit out of both. But as you can see, here we are in 2019, and basically each of the three has about a third market share in the town of Norwood. Now, what's the difference between Norwood and Falmouth? The big difference is that in Norwood, you had this municipal power utility in place. So that is a big advantage. So they have sales and marketing, they have trucks, they own the poles, and all those other sorts of things that, by dint of being in the power business, helps them get started and do this. So that's a clear difference. Nevertheless, they did it. There's another group of context in the state of Massachusetts, which is not the municipal power utilities, but rather the western Massachusetts towns that did not have any cable provider. They had no Comcast or Charter. They had only the telephone-based DSL service. These were known as the unserved towns. So, and there's 42 of them, and they were subject to a lot of federal and state subsidies to get them out of sort of the dark ages, if you will. First, there was a middle mile network that ran through the state with federal and state money. And then after that, the state of Massachusetts came in and subsidized 1/3 of the construction costs for the town networks for last mile service to the homes. So the analogy to Falmouth is, again, not perfect because these are unserved towns, but on the other hand, they did show a lot of models for how towns in Massachusetts can do this. And here are a few of them. I gave one example for each of these buckets, but there were actually a few of each. In the town of Leverett, you had the town build the whole thing by itself. It had, contractors and partners. It actually had help from another municipality. Holyoke Gas and Electric is their network operator. You have the town of Otis, where different, it sort of outsourced this to Westfield, which is a city with a municipal utility and broadband business, and they're building the network for Otis. You had others where the Commonwealth put out an RFP and ended up giving just a subsidy to the cable provider. There were several towns where Comcast just got a subsidy to build where they had not yet built, and the same with Charter. So basically, the Commonwealth put out an RFP and made the decision. Comcast and Charter came forward, said, I'll finish the job. They hadn't done it before. They got the money. They finished and built out their networks. And then there was another model where a bunch of the towns got together and tried to do something collectively. The point of the story is just that there's a number of different models, different partnerships that occurred within these different examples, especially the Leverett and the Otis, where there's a lot of nuance in how those towns did it. And this gets at some of the nuance. This is the town of Leverett, Massachusetts, and it just kind of gives you, don't have to go into all the detail. We're kind of heavy on the presentations here. But there's, they had project management services by another utility, Holyoke Gas and Electric. They have Eversource and Verizon doing the pole attachment agreements. They have contractors building the network. And the select board is obviously managing the whole thing. You have, what you ended up with was Crocker Communications. If you live in Leverett, you're actually paying your internet bill to Crocker Communications. And you know, I can share this slide with you later, but we'll move on through these. I wanted to get to what sort of the meat of what David was talking about, of what is a study? You know, what is it that actually happens here? And what would happen with whoever you might select would be that first there'd be an assessment of what the municipality needs. So what does the town government need that it maybe doesn't already have? You know, what assets do you have that could be used to build a network? Engaging with you know, some of these anchor institutions, or most of them are already served by OpenCape, and identify their needs, and of course engage with OpenCape, which would be a strong partner in the effort. So this is sort of, you know, just going over some of those same points about going over what assets could be used and what roles, you know, OpenCape might play. You develop a network design, a cost estimate, and then strategic guidance, evaluate the various feasibility of connecting anchor institutions, priority businesses, and town facilities, and support future applications like smart cities applications and last mile to homes. And you could build a network and the town could run it directly, or you could have a private provider do the operation of the network. So these are the kinds of questions that a study would address. What are your options? What's the role of OpenCape? How would it be governed? How would it be financed? And that is basically, in a nutshell, what a study would do. I'd be happy to answer questions at the right time about some of these other examples, because they're quite interesting. So that's it. Thank you. Would you want to go back to the state, or? Oh, the last slide? Okay, I'm sorry, yes. The final thing that would appear in a study would be the business model. You'd have detailed spreadsheets of the income and cash flow statements. What would the, you know, funding strategies and ownership models be? What would the potential business models be? And what approaches might you use to incent private investment? You know, if the town went halfway, maybe that would be enough for a private provider to do the rest of the job. So, yeah, okay.
I gotta wait for the oh, it's working. That's good. So at this point, we have gone through the formal presentations and we've entered a question and answer period. And some of you had filled out questionnaires or put questions down on a piece of paper. Have these been handed in to anybody?
Does anybody have any they'd like to hand in? Show of hands, anybody? Or we could do questions directly from the microphones I have and
Okay.
back there.
While you're doing that, why don't we go ahead and we'll just take a question.
So if you just want to say your first name and your question.
And if you could stand just so that people see you.
My name is Mary Lois Snowman, and I have a question about the impact of net neutrality. I'm wondering if right now the timing is good for marketing this for a couple of reasons. One, cord cutting is happening at an accelerated rate. People want internet to watch Netflix, Hulu. And then what could happen with net neutrality? Can we be throttled with our speed? I feel like maybe some of that's happening with Comcast, and is this a hedge against that?
You want to take a stab at that, or David, or both of you?
I would too, yeah.
Oh, good. Okay. So my answer is that first of all, network neutrality, that means that the internet provider, such as Comcast or Verizon or our community network, treats all traffic equally. They can't favor Amazon and unfavor Barnes and Noble. They can't block the New York Times but favor the Washington Post. Network neutrality means that all traffic gets treated in the same even-handed manner. Doesn't mean that everything arrives exactly equally. It means that there is no deliberate interference with the traffic. The question is, what is the impact of our community network on network neutrality? Okay, so network neutrality under the Obama administration was the law of the land. Then under the current FCC, they've repealed network neutrality, so it's no longer the law of the land. That means that if Comcast or Verizon wants to stop you from seeing certain things it doesn't want you to see, or has an agreement that makes it advantageous for you to see other things, and they speed those up so you can see them, they can do that. That's legal. A community network can be as neutral or as biased as the community wants it to be. And I'll stop there.
And thank you, David. I was going to make that same point with the additional aspect of privacy. Yeah, sorry. I would double down on that same point and say that with respect to privacy, just as you won't have a private provider that's going to sort of be net neutral as you could be, the privacy rules are something that you can set within your community so that your privacy and your net neutrality are what you would like them to be. So that is something that a town or a community can do. And in fact, let me add one thing, by the way. Concord is one of the towns that has a municipal light plant and a fiber to the home business. And when net neutrality was repealed, and I know anecdotally they got phone calls canceling Comcast and going in with the town network, which is, this did happen. It's a differentiator and people noticed and changed providers on that basis.
My name is Bruce Taylor. Could Art or somebody talk a little bit about Open Cape's experience or legal or structural implications of actually providing the kind of support directly for a municipal network like we're talking about?
Art's in the back of the room, but he's coming forward.
Hi. Yeah, thank you for the question. I don't have to remember what it was. Well, Open Cape was originally constructed as a middle mile provider. That means that we basically built the highway and a relatively small number of off-ramps, which went mainly to large companies, government, and stuff like that, because that's what we could get the money to do. Open Cape's stance in terms of the municipal networks is that we encourage them, we want to encourage them, and we want to cooperate with their formation in any way that we can. It's not Open Cape's intent necessarily to be the driver. We do not intend to become another Comcast. That's not a goal of the company. I mean, Open Cape is a nonprofit. It was built with the idea that It was here to serve the purposes of the community. And the community is not just the Cape, it's southeastern Massachusetts and South Shore as well. So Open Cape would be happy to, work with this. Our backbone, as you can see, goes through the town extensively. And that actually is a big help in the sense that one of the costs, there's two major costs in building a network like this. One is the backbone, and that to a large extent is built if you decide to use Open Cape. And then there's the laterals of getting to every house or every neighborhood and so forth, and that would still have to be built. But because of the geography of the town, Falmouth is surprisingly well covered at this point.
Open Cape actually does do some retail business. They not only serve the town government, the library, et cetera, et cetera. They also serve several hotels, motels. They serve the scientific institutions down in Woods Hole. They serve 40 entities in Falmouth, and they're rolling out service to Falmouth's Main Street Business District. So it's not like Open Cape is doing no retail business whatsoever. It's just they don't want to drive a full-scale residential community network type service.
Yeah, thank you. Let me add, since you brought that up, let me add a couple more things, and that is that, yeah, we are in the process in cooperation with the EDIC of building down Main Street here, just to from the green basically to just past the library, and rolling out services for that. And we also just recently have done a couple contracts to provide some trial residential service in other towns. This is small scale stuff. It's mainly places where there are buildings that have some businesses with apartments on top. And so we're doing that, and part of the reason for doing that is to gain the experience about what it is to service on a larger scale.
We have a question, yes.
Yeah, I'm Alan Jaffe, and I just have comments or questions, I guess. My understanding of these type networks is the most difficult thing is the last mile. In other words, the connection from some sort of hub to the house itself. And I think it would have been nice if the town had laid down dark fiber with all this road construction and stuff like that going on, that they could have easily done that without a large cost. And I would encourage you guys to see that they do it from now on. Secondly, like I said, the last mile is the problem. The telephone poles, for example, I think they're half owned by the electric company and half owned by the telephone company, something like that. They're owned by people, so you just can't go hang up your wires on them. And it's a large difficulty. I did see the wireless solution, which seems to be the one to avoid that, but I don't know how well that works. But that was just my comment.
These are good questions. Art, do you want to address any of that first?
Yeah, a little bit of it. In terms of the pole licensing, Open Cape has licensed, I've lost count, somewhere between 16 and 18,000 poles, both in Massachusetts and in Rhode Island. And so we've got a fair amount of experience with the type of stuff, with what has to be done. And that's, every municipal network has to deal with that, unless they happen to be in a town where it's lucky enough that the town, because of a municipal power company, owns the pole. So that's a manageable thing. The other thing I would just say is that there are options, and even within the town of Falmouth, it may turn out that in some neighborhoods, the right choice is to do fiber to the home. In other neighborhoods, say ones that are primarily
The library will be closing in about 1/2 hour. Please be aware that the public computers turn themselves off 10 minutes before. Check out any items to the circulation desk at the
let's move the meeting to the circulation
Yeah,
desk.
Peter,
So
you can address that on, yeah.
They pushed the wrong page button.
Um,
Anyway.
So fiber to homes is certainly an option in many cases, but there may be areas in which the best solution is to go fiber into a neighborhood, bring it to a block, and then do fixed wireless from there. That's the type of thing that the feasibility study will help us show. It's also the thing that if this is a locally owned, operated, controlled network, that can be decided on a case-by-case basis. It's not going to be, a large national company which is trying to roll out a one-size-fits-all model and say that's what you get.
Okay.
And I would like to add, you raise a point about why can't they put conduit down the street? And it seems like a logical question. Unfortunately, we have some of the people on the selectmen you should answer. You should address that question to them. But the point is that putting conduit in the ground, it sounds pretty easy, but there is a cost to it. And the town has to recognize that that's a priority and then budget for it. I can't speak for what's gone in the past. I would hope going forward they think that way. And I'll follow that up by saying, going back to my experience as a builder. For 30 years I was in the construction business, and I'd be building a new house. And it was cheap money, and it increased the value of the house to run. At that point there wasn't fiber optic, but I would run home runs of Cat5 cable throughout the house to a central point, just while the walls were open. I would run cable throughout the house so that when the customer got there, we could hook it up and he was ready to go. We didn't know which room he was going to put the stuff in, so it went into every room. But the cost was minor. And I would like to hope, going forward, if this ever goes anywhere, the builders like Doug and others would, as a matter of course, run fiber optic home run cable throughout the houses and buildings they built. I've had conversations already with a couple of builders about the idea, starting twisting their mind. And when the trenches are open from the street to the house, when they're putting in the other utilities, they drop a conduit in and throw the fiber in. It's not a lot of money, but it's a way of getting at that sort of issue. And it's a matter of rethinking what we're trying to do.
Got a question over there.
Yes.
Steve, I personally could care less about cable TV, but from the advertising they do, I would submit that many residential users like the fact that they can amortize their Comcast bill over not just internet, but also cable TV. Can community networks get that kind of content? Because I also submit that most people don't want to pay both bills.
Address that, Art?
Me again? Yeah. Well, that's, what services get offered would be something that would be for the town or this organization to look at. And the feasibility study would give us pros and cons of both. I agree with you that a lot of people don't want to pay another bill. And, but if there's a sufficient savings, they would. And over time, what we're seeing is that more and more people, are abandoning the fixed cable offerings for TV and so forth, and are using, streaming options. And so they sign up for a Hulu or an Amazon Prime or whatever. I don't want to list them all, but I don't want to pick people out either. So, and I think that's going to be the trend. There are ways in which, if it were decided that franchised cable or franchised TV services were a desirable or a necessary thing in Falmouth, there are ways that could be arranged.
I can add a little bit to that. We have examples in the state where the municipal provider does full triple play just like its competitors, and Norwood is one. So that you can get the triple play with Norwood or with Fios or Comcast in the town of Norwood. On the other hand, others don't do that. Like Concord, for reasons that it deemed valid, just decided to do data only. So you get just a fast, symmetrical data connection from the Concord Municipal Light Plant. If you want the triple play, you're working with Comcast, and that's just a decision that the town made. And there's many flavors of what the business models and the offerings could be, and that's just one of a handful of things that a study could address of, what is it that you would like to do and what are the pros and cons of those options. While I'm on Norwood, I want to add one thing that I meant to get into. I was kind of feeling the need to speed it along through the presentation. But when I talked to the Norwood, the person who runs the Norwood business, he really highlighted, what their basic strategy was and why, a customer might choose the Norwood triple play versus the others, even though not all the video offerings might be there because of exclusive deals that Comcast might be providing. And it's that they don't increase their prices. So it's not a short-term price with a price increase after a year or two. That's a big differentiator of the municipal networks. They don't do that to you. It's customer service. So you get a call, you're actually going to get somebody on the phone, and they're going to be out there that day at your house fixing the problem. I mean, again, you don't get that with the big providers. And they do other things. They're involved in the community, providing free Wi-Fi in public areas, donating to local groups. They're just kind of around. They're part of the community. It's the Main Street versus Wall Street, and he kept emphasizing that. There's a lot to that.
I think we have a lot more questions.
I just wanted
Okay.
to address one aspect of this very briefly, and that is that this is one of the really big questions that will definitely be addressed by a feasibility study. Should we offer just fast internet and depend on over-the-top services for our telephone and our video entertainment? Or should we actually offer the full retail triple play? That's an obvious question that will be addressed.
Sam, you had a question? Actually, a response.
One of your selectmen pushed long and hard about putting in a conduit whenever their utilities were opened up in the road. And Art was actually part of a discussion with our town manager and our DPW director. And I'm an engineer and a physicist by background, so I don't like to be snowed with technical arguments. But when they sat down and talked about the difficulties of running a conduit, first of all, you have to separate it from the water main that they're putting in right now, because if the water main breaks, you don't want to be cutting through fiber optics in order to be able to repair your water main. So you have to separate them. So there's a logistics issue and a lot of technical difficulty of doing that. In fact, Ray Jack was a part of that meeting, and he actually has experience in running conduits in the streets of Baltimore, and he talked a little bit about the technical challenges of intercepting other kinds of utilities that run under the street constantly and dealing with that as a problem. So we were looking at this a year and a half ago before they started digging in the streets, and it was pretty obvious that it's technically much more challenging than the naive assumptions that most of us have about just laying a fiber optic conduit or communication conduit in general in the street. It makes a lot of sense, and if we were an urban area, it would be justifiable. We would do that, and we would lease out the space and basically get that money back over long term, but it didn't make financial sense at this point. It's a bit more complicated than we might have assumed.
Court.
I think we had a question way in the back. Mike?
Thanks. Good evening, everyone. I'm Michael Galasso. I'm with the Falmouth EDIC. And Art's correct. We are currently working with the merchants on Main Street to install high-speed fiber to the merchants on Main Street because they had a problem running their credit cards during the summer when Comcast didn't have enough power to run that. So I've got two questions. The state announced earlier this week a green initiative which will provide money to communities to install what's called microgrids. I'm wondering whether or not we could get a line item in that bill to help us build out the fiber optic service here in Falmouth. I also want to thank you gentlemen for taking the time to put this together. Really appreciate it. I know how much time it takes to put these type of projects together from doing it from the EDIC. The other question I have is whether or not we ought to be thinking a little bit more broader. We talked about the cost of having to connect and to use the telephone poles that are owned by the telephone company in Eversource. Is it a good time now for us to be looking at doing our own electrical system in our community, like some of these other communities have, like Concord? Since we have to, string the lines and use their poles, shouldn't we just go ahead and buy the poles and buy out Eversource and have our own municipal power system? And wouldn't that be a good time to do that now? So those are my two questions, whether or not we can look at getting some money out of the bill that's being put together for the green initiative in our community, and whether or not we ought to broaden our horizon a little bit and just take over the power system in our community. Thank you.
Anybody want to handle that one?
Great question. I love thinking big.
I was going to try to be invisible. I guess I'm not very lucky at that. I don't want to get into the thing about, well, actually, in terms of the poles and so forth, I would be the last person to recommend that we buy the poles in Falmouth for a lot of reasons. One is, and perhaps the main one, is they're almost all in terrible shape. And when they break, you fix them. If they were brand new infrastructure, then maybe, but given the state of the poles in Falmouth, no. But I think it's a good thought, and it's something that is definitely worth thinking about. The other part of it is in terms of the green initiative for microgrids. I haven't seen that particular thing, but I know that Open Cape has had discussions with Eversource about some joint fiber efforts. They have fiber on our network. They use our network now for power monitoring and so forth. And there have been on and off discussions about how we could cooperate in terms of reaching deeper into neighborhoods. And I think as they want to do more management of electrical use in homes, which they will, especially as people start getting more and more electric cars, the managing of how that gets charged is a big problem for them. And so they're going to want to be able to do some scheduling and so forth. And to do that, they need the communications and so forth. And that means bringing some fiber into the neighborhood. So yes, I think they are a potential source of people to work with.
I'd like to reinforce what Art said. The city of Chattanooga, Tennessee, has a municipally owned electric service, and they began to build a municipally owned fiber optic network. And one of the key reasons for their building out the fiber network originally was to be able to better monitor the power outages, the needs in the communities, and so they built the fiber optic cable to service their electric company. And they were already in the towns and in the neighborhoods and around the streets and near the houses. And so it was a simple matter to say, well, if we can use it for that, we can use it for all the other services that you associate with. So this is a model, and this is what a feasibility study may show us.
The smart grid piece is another wrinkle. There are applications on a utility grid that need fiber. You don't need as much of it as you might think. You do need it for the key locations, generators, grid batteries, other key sites. Your substations need fiber, and you need fiber to the collectors that communicate with meters for the wireless AMI. You don't necessarily need it fiber to the home. Just to give
But it gets it close.
I mean, you need it, but they are two different things, but there is some overlap, and that can be leveraged.
Questions? Yes, sir.
I'm Jay Zavala. I had the privilege of serving on the Open Cape Board of Directors for a short period of time, so I can appreciate what they've done. My question is twofold. You mentioned a $50,000 estimate for a feasibility study. Is it possible that the other 14 towns on this Cape would join us in a collaborative effort, since Open Cape is distributed throughout the Cape, in a collaborative type of a county-run operation where Falmouth doesn't have to assume all of the burden and the risk, being first, although it likes to do that? And the second question that I have for you has to do with the other portion of this endeavor, and that's the service component. Running the cables is one, running the operations is a second one, and I haven't heard anything about that. What are the challenges that we would face there? And again, thank you for coming this evening.
Okay, customer service is key, especially in a local network. Having the service be locally based is one of the reasons that customers like it and communities support it. You don't get someone who's punching a clock in some call center, possibly in another country. You get someone who is local and could even, and in some cases do even, leave the telephone and come over to your house and help you diagnose the problem. This has happened with community networks. So even though we haven't talked about it very much, it is absolutely essential, and customer service is one of the huge strengths of a community network. I forgot your first question. Maybe someone else is better at it.
A collaborative effort.
Oh, the collaborative effort. Oh, yeah. Okay. So
like Lafayette, Louisiana, and Chattanooga, large cities, right?
Okay. If we expanded beyond Falmouth, we would also be looking at a more expensive feasibility study, perhaps a longer time to do it, more moving parts, more different town governments, more meetings like this, et cetera. I think there's a whole lot of merit to the word local, and so I would encourage us to start here now with what we've got, but I'd also like to hear David talk about a Cape-wide study versus a Falmouth study.
I agree with what David just said, and the devil is very much in the details, and I really don't mean to be here talking about what my company does. I mean, I'm slightly uncomfortable on that pace, but just to let you know, I know that when we do these, there's multiple revisions, and not until everybody knows every number, every assumption, and has worked them all over, and we're on version 32, and everybody understands it, is when that's done, was when the town says it's done. And yeah, as you broaden out, as David said, you have more entities to deal with, you're losing kind of the detail unless you multiply the cost as well. So I don't know that you benefit from it. Not to say that other towns shouldn't study, but I think you need to understand every block, every pole, every mileage, every premises, and really nail it all down is what you want. If it's one town or if it's 10 towns, you want that level of detail. You want to know what you're getting into. You had another point about where the operations cost. Yes, there's a capital cost, and then there's an operations and maintenance cost, which is ongoing, and part of that, and then there's the customer service cost. So there's multiple pieces to this. The slides that I skipped over because I saw a bunch of heads banging into the backs of chairs was some detail on that, but it gets gets heavy into who these entities are that are doing all these parts, what those costs are, how that's all worked out is very important to get right and include all those costs.
Got a question in the back. Yep.
Hi there, I'm Tom Pucci. I've been IT operations manager, town of Falmouth, 31 years. I'm sitting here with John Crockett. Him and I started putting in the first Wi-Fi point-to-point between the fire department and the town hall probably 25 years ago, when the cost of T1 carriers were unbelievably expensive. We've wired this building. We've put in the fiber between Town Hall and the fire station and the library. We've put a lot of Wi-Fi up. We've worked with Art and Open Cape, putting in all the beginnings of Open Cape, and our first agreement with a town, I think, was actually written by our IT department and you guys. And one of the things we did was, in order to avoid a lot of this licensing for the poles, is that when we connected, say, the senior center, there was a huge cost because Open Cape wanted to be able to use that commercially as well as drop to the senior center. Well, the poles had to be replaced, and there were 3 giant, what the hell are those things? Transformers on the top, and it was unbelievably expensive. But my question is, if this becomes a municipal project, can we not use the municipal space on the poles that already exist there? No? They won't let us? Okay, well, that was my question.
Yeah, no,
He says no.
Unfortunately, no, because oh boy, now we're getting real deep. Telephone pole structure. But basically, there are a couple zones on a pole. And if you look at a pole, you'll see way up high are the power lines, and then down below is the communications space. And that's where Verizon and Comcast and so forth is. It's where some of the Open Cape stuff is also. But if you actually look carefully at some of the poles in town, you'll see that Open Cape fiber is in a middle spot. It's there all by itself because we figured out that there was a small zone in between the 2 spots that if you did everything just right, you could put your fiber there. We're actually the only people in the country that have ever done that, but we got Verizon and Eversource to agree to that. The problem with using, and then the other zone in the poles is a municipal zone, and that's where the town can put fire. And originally, it was for fire alarms. Yeah, some of that may go away, but the other thing is that the restriction on that was that the traffic over that could only be used for town purposes. And so as soon as you were trying to sell a commercial service or a residential service, they're going to say no.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Todd Sadler. My question is, we've talked a lot about, the feasibility study and those types of things, but who does that? Where are we going from here on, like, for a timeline? How long is it, who do we have to get authorized to authorize an RFP? I know town government can sometimes take quite a while on these types of projects, but, I just want to kind of get an idea of what I'm getting into.
That's an excellent question, and we are at a point where we are an informal committee, and we're not authorized by anybody. We're trying to convince those who want to be, who can authorize this stuff, like our selectmen, like the town, like maybe the EDIC, to take the ball and run with it. We're an advocacy group. And this is obviously the next step. We want to get a feasibility study done. We want to get a feasibility study done relatively soon. This group, informal as we are, have no standing to put out an RFP to anybody. We could, but where are we going to get $50,000 and what do we do with it? So what we got to hope is that we can convince our selectmen that maybe they authorize town funds for a feasibility study on this, and I will come and talk to you folks at your next meeting about that very point. Or another option is that we go to the next meeting of the EDIC next Tuesday and talk to them about this and maybe convince them that they should be the body to do this. Or there may be other approaches. We don't want to let the ball drop right here. We want this to be the first step. We want you people to stay involved with this. We want to push this ball forward. We don't want to go home after this is over and say, well, that was great. We had a meeting with 80 people or more in it. We want to see this be the first step, like I said when we started, and you have a question.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if we need to take a step back and think about mobilizing the community. You said faster, cheaper. Maybe we need to explain in layman's terms what people get for this. Right now, we're at, I think, 200 Mbps speed. I think your slide showed we could get to 1,000. Like, what does that mean for the average citizen? And then how much cheaper is it compared to what we're paying now through Comcast, according to case studies from other towns?
You want to?
Well, I mean, it depends what the costs are and then how much of the cost of building the network.
It's about $90 a month for the 200 Mbps through Comcast.
What I was getting at was what your eventual town service kind of pricing would depend on, okay, so what's the cost of the network to build it? You design it, you have a cost estimate for the network, and then you say, okay, what is it going to take to pay back the bond and the operating costs on the network? And then how much of that, maybe there's a subsidy that the town puts in or that taxpayers put in for parts of it, and then how much has to come back from the pricing. So the pricing structure can depend on the business model that would end up being selected.
What happened in Norwood?
Norwood has chosen to, and I have his notes there, that they're keeping their prices, you know, kind of right around. They're not trying to get into a price war with Comcast because it's frankly not a war that you can win. In Braintree, to give you one example, they did try to undercut Comcast, and Comcast can undercut them, and you know that's not a game that you really win. So you want to compete more on service, meaning speeds.
But if they don't have fiber optic here, I mean, the
Comcast? Well, they would
the
have
most speed, the highest speed they're going to get is what?
They have a hybrid fiber coax network, and I haven't done speed tests. You know, we've heard anecdotally that at certain times of year the speeds are horrible. So the speeds are very much a function of how many people are using the network at any one time. So yeah, maybe at 3 o'clock in the morning in February, you can stream at 500 megabits, but try that on July 4th when it's raining. If that helps you answer your question.
Yeah. Those are really good questions, and the way we develop that picture is from a feasibility study. Sorry to sound like a broken record. You get the picture, right? Once we have that, then we can draw a bunch of scenarios about price and service and time to build and all that stuff that are much more relevant to retail customers.
That's right, and David is explaining things better than I. That such a study would lay out a number of scenarios that the town could choose to do in terms of operating models and in terms of types of service and pricing of service, how those would affect the budgets. You know, give many different knobs to turn to look at all those options.
I would just make one addition to that, and again, and it seems like common sense, but it's worth stating again, and that is if the town were to build such a network, they figured out how to do it, they come up with a good business plan and so forth, the key is to attract customers. The key is to have somebody decide that they will be better off by going with a local network because of whatever, service, price, a combination of things, and certainly any network that gets built, if it's going to succeed, has to be competitive with, it doesn't mean they're going to come in and go, as he said, sell the same thing that Comcast does for a quarter of the price just to say it's cheaper. Yeah. Right. And I think one of the things that we need to do, and this is what I'm hoping that, and I'm going to start working toward, because we've all been here close to an hour and a half, and that's wonderful. Nobody's fallen asleep yet, so that's a good thing. But so that doesn't happen, we do need to start to wind this up. And that is that the feasibility study is a step. The other step is that there are a lot. There are 30,000 year-round residents in this town, and it expands to 100,000 in the summer. And those people that aren't in this room become the basis of support for a change like this. This can't happen in a vacuum. We have a great group here. We're thrilled, quite frankly, with the turnout here. We thought we would be lucky if we got 30 people. So to see this turnout is great. And I think that's a great first step. That's what we need. But we need you all to now go out and sell it to your friends. Because it's going to be a slog now a little bit. Yes, there'll be a feasibility study, but there also needs to be lobbying of our selectmen. There needs to be convincing of all those people in the town meeting that raise money, that vote the taxes, that set the priorities. They need to hear from people like you that this is important. And spending money is all about priorities. Is it we spend our money on another playground, on a community center, on fiber optic cable? These are the things that town meeting and everyone, it's economics 101, every family unit struggles with having to make choices. There's only so much money and there are so many things. This is economics 101. But it's not going to happen without the support of the town. And that means town meeting, it means the citizens, and we need to sell that, and hopefully you will help us sell it.
I think, Courtney, we have 2 more questions. One up from one.
So I have really more of a comment and an offer. First, my name's Bob Egan. I'm a network architect and technologist. I was one of the founders of Wi-Fi. So I've been around this business a very long time. I think the other thing is you talk about selling this to the populace and the town council is also to sell this and make the bet on the future of Falmouth. Because when I have worked with other municipalities, it's more about thinking around the smart city model, right? Which is just not about what today's cable looks like, what today's phone service looks like, what today's internet, and of course the dependencies associated with the politics of net neutrality. But really to think about what the future of video services and internet services is going to look like, and building that and operating that as a town entity. It tends to attract business. It helps with our education and our youth base, but both in retaining but attracting a younger population as well. So I think that has to be part of the sales pitch. And my offer is to help you along with some of that if you want time.
Yeah, this is Ken Peel. Just a question about the feasibility study. When you come to evaluate the community needs, how do you prioritize the homeowner versus the small business? Most people here, I think, are homeowners. They want to know what I'm going to get at my house. And we're talking about other needs, right? So how do you prioritize those two?
One way is to do, a statistically valid mailed survey of the community, which is something that I and I'm sure the other firms have done, our firm and others also do. That's one way to get a good sampling of what people want, what they're willing to pay for, what the needs assessment is.
And that goes for businesses as well. There's a question way in the back.
Hi, my name is Joseph Kellendorfer. I'm actually one of those startups, spin-offs from our scientific institutions, so I'm speaking from the small business opportunity here, and I think outlining the importance of supporting businesses and economic attraction is very important. I think for our community, we're very attractive to live. It's important to attract young folks to work here. It's not difficult from a attraction point of view, but a reliable internet, a reliable connection is very important for those kind of modern workforces that we need. I work with teams all over now where the office is a laptop, you need high internet connection, and we can attract people. So I think that's important to keep an eye on those as well, and I'm happy to help in this aspect as well.
And that's the point. We see this as a part of our economic future. And I'm going to take 2 more questions, and then hopefully,
Can I just respond?
yeah.
Yeah, one of the things I think it's important, Sam Patterson, to recognize is in the comments that were just made about the need for high-speed internet for business purposes, but the best way for this town to grow is by having home businesses, knowledge workers in their homes doing consulting around the world, but they have to have that internet service for that to happen. It's going to be the least impact to our environment if we raise our businesses by those kinds of cottage businesses, if you will, literally doing business around the world. That's the vision that we should be looking at in terms of the growth of this town, to have the least impact on our estuaries and on our overall, if you will, ambiance of this town. So I want to leave that thought with you, because I agree with Courtney. It's going to take a community upwelling of changing the vision in the town leaders. But you got me from already.
Are there any other
questions?
One more question.
I think you kind of said it. My name is Sarah Canning. So what can we do to help you get your feasibility done? Like, what can we do as a community? There's a lot of networking on Facebook. There's a lot of networking on the internet that, like, a lot of us are involved in. What can we do?
Well, I mean, I think the lift to get a feasibility study done is not perhaps as big as you may think it is. It's the expenditure, as David outlined, isn't that vast in the scheme of things. It's once you have a study and you have options, put out before you, and then deciding what to do. That's the real, that's the hard one. But I think that from what I've seen communities with a lot less interest in this that have gone ahead and done feasibility study just because there's somebody like David and Courtney who are advocating for it. So, but it's a decision for your leadership to make, and I don't know how to help you do that. It's really up to you guys.
Well, if I could add, Peter Cook here. If I could add this, I've been spending the last few weeks advertising this on 4 or 5 Facebook Falmouth groups, and a number of people. I'm glad you came out as a result of seeing all that. Hope I didn't bore you to death, but I'm glad you came. So what you do from here, you go and you actually go out and tell people you came to this meeting, what was discussed. Obviously, FCTV is going to be broadcasting this on their channel, and tell people to go listen to what we've talked about tonight. But spread the word. This is the only way it gets out to more people. You're a core group right here of people who actually thought of coming on a Tuesday night to the library and sit and listen to all this and ask your questions. This is where it begins. So everybody here has an obligation to tell 2 people, and to tell more people than that what the ideas that were expressed here, and then we expand the audience.
Local investment for community service, not for profit, and community control, which means network neutrality, freedom from surveillance, upgrading as necessary, great customer service, etc.
So across the nation, it's already shown that the price of the home goes up 3 to 4% in a network lit environment. So that is a sales pitch that we can use straight across the board for everybody to use cost justification, right?
You are absolutely right. They have done numerous studies that have shown that when fiber optic cable is run to a house, even whether it is activated or not, but it's there, it enhances the value of that property, whether it's a business or a home. And it's been shown over and over again. And so when you think about this, if fiber optic cable were run to every home in the city, in the town of Falmouth, in every business, and whether they signed up for it or not, that property owner benefits from the increased value. And in fact, that's one of the funding sales pitches that goes into it. So it is an important concept. Now, I know we could stay on here and some of you are interested in doing, but it's probably past some of your bedtime. And so we need to kind of wind this up. Not to say this is the last of it. It's the beginning. And the next step is the feasibility study. But do you want to say a few things first and then?
Okay. Well, first of all, let's thank our guest speaker, David Talbot, who came down from Boston. Thank you, David. Thank you, David. Okay. Second, our email address for the 5 of us is falmouthnet@gmail.com. You can reach all 5 of us that way. Third, if anybody knows any wealthy individuals, the 5 of us could become a nonprofit 501c3 in a week and take their $50,000 and do that feasibility study on our own. It wouldn't be as good as if we had the community all rising up together, but it would be a way to get it done. Or 5 wealthy individuals who could kick in $10,000, or businesses who thought it was in their interest to have better work at home for their employees, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of ways to skin that cat if there's community support. So finally, I want to thank everybody, the distinguished people, Bob Egan and Steve Tom, who have spent their lives in the networking profession, and the rest of, I see a lot of friends here and a lot of distinguished members of our community. And thank you all very much for coming out and spending your Tuesday evening on this important topic. Art?
I'd like to add just one thing, and that is, in case you're sort of like, well, how could this really happen? Is this even possible? I'll point out that Open Cape, which we've talked a lot about, started out as 3 people meeting in a room. No money, no support, or anything else. We started talking to other people in towns across Cape, spent a lot of time with that. Ultimately, we managed to get a $50,000 grant from the Cape Cod Commission to do, guess what, a feasibility study. And everything, then took off from there. So if you think, how could a group of just a couple people, with all of you in this room, manage to accomplish something like that? I can give you a sound example right here on the Cape that it can be done.
The silent member of our committee.
Thank everyone for giving us your name and email address. If you missed this list, there's the contact information. Just send us your information and we will get you on the list. Thank you very much for coming tonight.
One last thing, and then the meeting is adjourned. And that is, if any of you are interested in becoming involved with this effort, just send an email to falmouthnet@gmail.com and we'll put you to work. Thank you for coming.